McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 5, Chapter 18, Arts of Islam and of Africa. Chapter Outline, Arts of Islam, Arts of Africa. Arts of Islam. The spread of Islam affected local artistic traditions. Arts of Islam. Islamic mosaics are designed for collective worship based on the model of the Prophet Muhammad's house and include qibla walls, mihrab niches, minbars, and minarets. A mosque is an Islamic house of worship. Begun in the 8th century, the Great Mosque at Cordoba grew to be the largest place of prayer in Western Islam. The interior of the prayer hall is vast, with horizontal space measured out by a forest of columns. Daylight enters through doorways placed around the perimeter of the hall. Filtered through myriad columns and arches, it creates a complex play of shadows that makes the extent and the shape of the interior hard to grasp. Alternating red and white stones break up the visual continuity of the arch forms. Oil lamps that once hung in the front of the focal point of worship offer flickering light that reflects off gold ornamentation and creates more dancing shadows. Entering this vast and mostly dark interior, our attention is drawn to the dome. At the center of the far wall, its glittering gold and colorful, ornate designs lit up by windows. The dome emphasizes the most important location within the mosque, the mihrab niche. During services, Muslims face the mihrab to direct their prayers towards the holy site of Mecca. The builders of the Great Mosque in Cordoba offer the faithful a golden focal point filled with passages of sacred text, geometric patterns, and flowery motifs. The symmetrical combination of round and pointed forms in the dome and in the intersecting arches below also grab our attention. One of the first requirements of Islamic rulers is to find a suitable place for congregational prayer, a mosque. The Great Mosque at Cordoba in Spain was an early example. The Congregational Mosque at Kairouan in Tanzania is another. Located on the northern edge of Africa, Kairouan was founded in the 7th century as a military outpost based on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean in Syria. The builders of the mosque at Kairouan drew their inspiration from the descriptions of the Prophet's house. Built of sun-dried brick around a central courtyard, on one wall, the house had an open porch made of palm trunks, providing shade and shelter. There the Prophet had preached to the gathered faithful. At Kairouan, the shaded porch of Muhammad's house became a large prayer hall. This is the covered structure to the right. With a roof supported inside by rows of columns, the courtyard before the prayer hall is lined with covered arcades or rows of arches. Over the entry to the courtyard rises a large square tower called a minaret. From its height, a crier calls the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. A worshipper entering from the courtyard and walking up the aisles would be walking towards the mihrab, an empty niche set into the far wall. This is the Qibla wall, which indicates the direction of Mecca. Muhammad told his followers to face Mecca during prayer, and all mosques, no matter where in the world, are oriented toward that city. Inside every mosque, the mihrab marks the Qibla wall. The dome-covered space we examined in Cordoba provides a sense of ornamentation builders placed around the mihrab to focus attention and honor the faith. A minbar, or an elevated pulpit for the imam who leads prayer, is located near the mihrab and accessed through the minbar. Such doors as this are ornate and remarkably well preserved. This example made for the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt. During the 12th century, Persian architecture inspired a new form of mosque, illustrated here by one of the earliest and most influential examples, the Friday Mosque of Isfahan in Iran. The photograph shows the view from the entrance to the courtyard. Directly ahead is a large vaulted chamber with a pointed arch, opening set in a rectangular frame. This is an iwan, a form that served to mark the entry to a royal reception hall in the Parisian palaces, and adopted to mosque to add prestige. Arts of Islam. Islamic mosques are decorated with plant forms, geometric patterns, and passages of text in mosaic, tile, and woodwork. Example 1. Islamic mosque decorations. Example 2. Islamic mosque decorations. In this image of the blue mosque, a painted passage from the Quran rings the domes just above the windows, which are made of glass. The windows make the dome seem to float and illuminate the glazed tiles, bearing floral and geometric patterns. The large courtyard outside provides respite from the city outside the mosque's walls. Arts of Islam. Muslim rulers built lavish palaces decorated with muqarranas. Muqarrana is a form of decorative vaulting in Islamic architecture. In muqarranas, the surface of a vault or a dome is subdivided into niche-like cells that have no load-bearing function, also known as stalactite vaulting or honeycomb vaulting. Arts of Islam. Calligraphy is a revered art form in the Muslim world, used to copy the Quran. Writing out the Quran, which Islamic scholars commonly memorize, is viewed as an act of prayer. Calligraphy thus became the most highly regarded art in the Islamic lands. Arts of Islam. Islam prohibits the representation of holy persons, but permits figures in secular context. Although the Quran could not be illustrated with figural images, other books could. Books were the major artistic outlet for painters in Islamic culture. Working with the finest pigments and brushes that tapered to a single hair, artists created scenes of entrancing detail, such as this battle scene from the Persian Book of the Kings. Ceramic arts were also celebrated in the Muslim world. The bull, with courtly and astrological signs, was created in Persia around the year 1200. The bull's interior pictures the sun in the center. 5 planets and the moon occupy the next ring, each depicted in human form. Although the sun appears in the middle, Islamic astrologers believed that the earth was the center of the universe and the other planets revolved around it. Princes on horseback appear in the next ring, while the upper edge of the interior has seated courtiers. By combining astrological personifications and members of the royal family, the bull gives earthly rulers a divine right to govern. Earthly princes are part of the natural forces that govern life on earth. European rulers made similar claims, tracing their lineage back to the biblical figures and the gods of ancient Greek and Roman mythology. Arts of Islam. Islamic crafts are highly regarded. Among the most famous Islamic textiles are the immense rugs known as the Aberdale carpets. Like most Islamic carpets, the Aberdale carpets were created by knotting individual tufts of wool onto a woven ground. The labor was minute and time-consuming. The Aberdale carpet shown here has over 300 knots per square inch, or over 35 million knots in all. This Parisian woman's coat was made in Iran during the Safavid dynasty. Like the manuscript painting, it offers a glimpse of Parisian sartorial splendor, as male and female courtiers dressed in fine garments decorated with figural and ornamental designs. The Parisian elite wore bright colors and complementary combinations, with robes or tailored jackets over loose silk pants. Silk production and distribution were controlled by the Safavid ruler, who gave embroidered silk and velvet as diplomatic gifts to Persia's allies. Islamic crafts are highly regarded. Arts of Africa. The oldest art in Africa was created by Egyptian, Kush, and Nok artists. The Nile that nourished Egypt also supported kingdoms just to the south, in a region called Nubia. Nubia was linked by trade networks to lands south of the Sahara Desert, and it was through Nubia that the rich resources of Africa, ebony, ivory, gold, incense, and leopard skins, flowed to Egypt and into the Mediterranean basin. The most famous Nubian kingdom was Kush, which rose to prominence during the 10th century BCE and lasted for over 1,400 years. The gold ornament illustrated here comes from a Kushian royal tomb, the Pyramid of a Queen. A sensitively modeled ram's head protrudes from the center of the ornament, a symbol in Kush, as in Egypt, of the solar deity Amun. Over the ram's head, the disk of the sun rises before a faithful representation of an entryway to the Kushian temple. Several millennia later, and further to the west, a civilization thrived in the area of modern-day Nigeria, known as the Nok. The people worked iron into tools and fired terracotta clay. They left behind thousands of sculpted terracotta figures, created using the coiling technique, some just the heads and others full bodies. The female figure shown here was made between 900 and 300 BCE. Like most Nok sculpture, it has abstracted features on a hollow cylindrical body. The figure wears a thick necklace and has her arms pulled up to her body. Whether she represents an ancestor, a living person, or a sacred being is unknown. The Nok left no written record behind, nor did any other culture write about them at the time. Arts of Africa. The spread of Islam brought mosque architecture to Africa, while the spread of Christianity brought church architecture. Example 1. The spread of Islam brought mosque architecture to Africa, while the spread of Christianity brought church architecture. Here is an example of how the spread of Islam brought mosque architecture to Africa. Islam was not the only foreign religion to make inroads into Africa in the first millennium. Christianity arrived very early, and Jesus' disciple Mark embellished himself in Alexandria, Egypt. Ethiopia, on Africa's east side, was especially receptive to Christian teachings, and Christianity became its official religion in the 4th century CE. 11 rock cut-out churches in Ethiopia remain as evidence as the spread of the faith. The Church of St. George at Lalibela has a central plan in the shape of a cross. Cut directly into volcanic rock, it was made in the 12th century for King Lalibela as part of his plan to turn Ethiopia into a new Jerusalem. He may have been inspired to do so by the news that the Holy Lands had been seized by the Muslims. The church's interior, hollowed from stone, has aisles separated by columns and topped by high arches. Relief carvings and paintings adorn the walls, and windows allow light into surprisingly spacious interiors. Other nearby rock-hewn churches are similarly impressive, and Lalibela continues to attract pilgrims even today. Arts of Africa. The ruling elite in Zimbabwe constructed large enclosures with towers. Further south along the eastern side of Africa, Muslim and Christian travelers encountered other civilizations known for their stone architecture. In an area in modern-day Zimbabwe, roughly 200 ancient stone structures and enclosures dot the landscape. The largest, called Great Zimbabwe, was built between the 11th and 15th centuries CE, and may have served as a court of the Bantu-speaking people. The site included courtyards, thatched roof huts, passageways, conical towers, and thick rounded walls. Pictured here is a section known as the Great Enclosure. Its circular wall is 820 feet around and reaches over 30 feet high. Early European traders marveled at the load-bearing stone construction. Archaeology has revealed that the stone structures were built by the local ruling elite, who raised cattle and traded gold along the nearby rivers. Resting on the elevated ground, the thick walls are not thought to be fortifications for defense, but displays of power and wealth. They sheltered between 200 and 300 people, while 10,000 residents lived along the river below. Other sites with similar walls and configurations are found in the area, though none as large or as extensive as the Great Zimbabwe. Example 1. Yoruba and Benin art pictured sacred kingship with the idealized likeness in royal regalia, as seen in this image of the interior of Oba's compound, which was burnt during the siege of the Benin city in 1897. Example 2, from chapter 11, The Head of a King, from the Yoruba in the 13th century, brass and life-size. Example 3. Like the rulers of ancient Egypt, the kings of Benin are viewed as sacred beings. Sacred kingship is common to many African societies, and art is often used to dramatize and support it. A brass head that once formed part of an altar represents a king known as an Oba. It is not so much a likeness, but a symbol of royal power. Dressed in the regalia of office, the facial features are abstract, with geometric shapes, exaggerated eyes, and 3 parallel scars above each eyebrow. An elaborate crown hangs over the head, and the neck is covered by tall necklaces. A large hole at the top of the head once held an elephant tusk. The missing tusk reminds us that this brass sculpture was joined by materials such as bells, rattles, food, and even animal blood. The altar was made for the sitting Oba, so that he could consult his ancestors on matters of rulership, and it formed part of the rich array of symbolic art that promoted the royal authority in Benin. Creating the appropriate setting for a king led the Yoruba sculptures of Olowe of Isles to carve a series of posts for the patio of the palace at Ikire in today's Nigeria. In the post illustrated here, the king leans forward in his throne. One of his wives kneels before him, accompanied by a flute-playing deity. Standing behind the king is a large figure of his main queen, taller than the king, even with his pointed crown. This hierarchy of scale communicates the queen's importance within the royal court. She is painted blue, with the scarification on her cheeks and completed coiffure. Her missing front teeth reflect the Yoruba ideal of beauty, and her exaggerated eyes show that she is in communion with the ancestors. The queen stands protecting her husband and acting as his valued political and spiritual advisor. Arts of Africa. Many African art, shrines, and altars offer a point of communication with ancestors and the spirit world and are used in rituals and ceremonies. Example 1. Many African art, shrines, and altars offer a point of communication with ancestors and the spirit world. In this work, the 4 small figures beneath the stool may refer to the support that the couple receives from their ancestors or other spirits. Communication with deceased ancestors is also the purpose of reliquaries. Made by the Kota people in Gabon in Central Africa, the Kota use reliquaries to honor their ancestors and to ask for guidance and protection. Made of wood covered in a copper alloy sheet, Kota Guardian reliquaries represent an abstracted head with a semicircular eye and triangular nose. A large, rounded crest appears at the top of the head. 2 arms jut out below the neck, but there is no torso or lower body. Instead, the reliquary was attached to a bark bundle or a basket containing relics, skulls, bones, and belongings of the deceased ancestor. Polished to a shiny finish, the metal sheaths deflecting danger away from the living. Created to be used in ceremonies. Like much African art, the reliquary we see in the photograph is incomplete. During rituals to communicate with the dead, living participants would speak to the relics, provide food, offerings, and make their petitions to their ancestors. Among the best known and most visually compelling works of spiritual agency are the power figures, Meninsky, or singular Ninsky, or medicine, of the Congo and the neighboring peoples of Central Africa. Meninskys are containers. They hold materials that allow a ritual specialist to harness the powers of the dead in service of the living. Almost any container can be an insky, but the most famous minskis are statues of hunters such as the one here, called Minonkandi, or singular Nonkandi. They hunt down and punish witches and wrongdoers. The Boer people of today's Burkina Faso in West Africa carved and painted masks that represented nature spirits, animals, humans, and supernatural beings. Each mask is painted red, black, and white, and features large round eyes, geometric patterns of scarification, and large wood hook representing the hornbilled bird. Although some Boer masks are just faces, others include tall crowns painted with similar designs. The tall planks seen here represent flying spirits. To transform the dancer into the spirit represented into the mask, a costume made of plant fibers covers the entire body. The fibers move with the dancer and rustle, making the experience of the mask a multisensory one. Whether performed for an agricultural ritual, a funeral, or marking the transition of boys to men, each stage of the lengthy masquerade is intentional. From the procession into the village to the dancers' movements, knowledge of the ritual is passed down through generations and is part of the initiation of young people into the community. One of the most extraordinary African masks is the Ijele, the most honored mask of the Ngobo people of Nigeria. Ngeli appears at the funeral of an especially important man, welcoming his spirit to the other world and easing his transition from one stage of being to the next. The meaning of Ijele are fluid and layered. In its towering aspect, Ijele resembles an anthill, structures that in Africa may reach the height of 8 feet, and which the Ngebo regard as porches to the spirit world. Ijele is also a venerable tree, the symbol of life, beneath whose branches wise elders meet to discuss weighty matters. Amid the tassels, mirrors, and flowers on the Ijele's branches are numerous sculpted figures of people, animals, and other masks, a virtual catalogue of the Ngobo and their world. Multiple large eyes suggest the watchfulness of the ever-present, though usually invisible, community of spirits. Majestic in appearance, Ijele moves with great energy, dipping, whirling, shaking, and turning. It is the great tree of meaning, of life itself, appearing briefly in the human community. Arts of Africa. African royal regalia and furniture symbolize the ruler's right to govern. This crown has a large abstracted face of the king's ancestor staring out with dark white-rimmed eyes and blue lips. At the pinnacle of the crown is a beaded bird, and numerous birds project from the sides of the cone. The birds refer to the female ancestor, whose powers the king must draw on. Known as our mothers, they are believed to be able to transform themselves into night birds. A beaded veil obscures the ruler's face, for his subjects are not allowed to gaze directly on a sacred being. The crown gives form to the idea that the living king is one with his godly ancestors, for in wearing it, his head merges with theirs, and their many eyes look out. An African cloth that we continue to see in sub-Saharan Africa as well as in other parts of the world had its origins as a symbol of rulership. Woven in West Africa in today's Ghana, the kente cloth was once reserved for royalty. According to legend, a spider taught 2 young Asante men to weave the colorful cloth. The textile features a bold palette of red, yellow, black, green, and even gold thread woven into strips of geometric designs. The 4 to 6 inch stripes are sewn together to form sheets of fabric. Kente is woven in hundreds of patterns, each with its own name, history, and symbolism. Traditionally, a newly invented pattern was shown first to the king, who had the right to claim it for his own exclusive use. Rich, costly, and elaborate, royal kente was reserved for ceremonial occasions, worn over the shoulder and reaching to the ground. Even the furniture that touches the ruler has special power in some African communities. The Luva people live south and east of Asante. in the Central African nation known today as the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Luba kingdom thrived from the 17th to the 19th century, enriched by trade in salt and copper. Luba belief holds that each ruler is divine and descended from the first king, who overthrew a tyrant to establish good rulership. Kings trace their families back to the origins of Luba kingship, while strategic marriages of royal women to members of the regional elite helped to unify the territory and strengthen the king's authority. This stool is seen as the actual seat of power and symbolizes the stool given to the first Luba king. Arts of Africa. Some African art represents complementary gender roles. The base of many Luba stools, like the one here, represents a woman. Her body is abstracted, with small arms and legs and geometric facial features. She is, however, idealized according to Luba standards of beauty, with an elaborate hairstyle and scarification on her torso. The Luba believe that women's bodies draw spirits to them and serve as the source of the king's power, a political and spiritual cooperation that ensures the health of the Luba peoples. Complementary gender roles within the spiritual realm extended beyond the accessories of kingship in Africa. They are the subject of this early sculpture by an artist of the Dogon, a farming people who have lived in present-day Mali on Africa's western side since the 16th century. The sculpture portrays a couple seated side by side, rendered in a highly conventionalized abstract manner. The stool they share links them physically and symbolically, as does the man's arm placed around the woman's shoulder. With their tilted heads, tubular torsos, angular limbs, horseshoe-shaped hips, and evenly spaced legs, the two bodies almost mirror each other. Yet within this fundamental unity, differences appear. The man, slightly larger, speaks for the couple through his gestures. His right hand touches her breast, suggesting her role as a nurturer. His left hand rests above his own genitals, signaling the idea of procreation. On her back, not visible here, she carries a child. On his back, he carries a quiver. As often in African sculpture, abstraction suggests the work represents not specific people, but spirits or ideas. He is the begetter, hunter, warrior, and protector. She is the life-bearer, mother, and nurturer. Together with their child, they form a family, the basic unit of a Dogon community. Among the Dogon, the center of community is the meeting house, or togu na, meaning house of words. Built using the post and lintel construction technique, the open-sided meeting house in this photograph has wood beams supported by forked wood posts. Its roof is made of millet stalks, a local crop, which are bundled together and rest atop beams. The vertical supports are carved in relief, showing female figures with oversized breasts, couples, riders on horseback, and animals. Although female bodies appear on the post, the meeting house is open only to men. Shaded from the sun under the low ceiling, the men sit inside performing ceremonies, working, visiting, and discussing community matters. It is thought that their discussions are informed by female ancestors, a possible explanation for the women carved into the post. Arts of Africa. Masquerades offer spiritual agency, with mask put into action by dancers, but mask and ceremonial objects in museums deny their important context. Example 1. Masquerades offer spiritual agency. Example 2. Masquerades offer spiritual agency. The great African art of spiritual agency, and perhaps the greatest of African arts, is the masquerade, involving sculpture, costume, music, and movement. A masquerade does not merely context spirit powers to effect change, it brings the spirits themselves into the community. In Western museums, African masks are commonly exhibited and viewed as sculpture, but in Africa, a mask is never displayed in public as an isolated, inert object. It appears only in motion, as part of the incarnation of a spirit being that has appeared in the human community. Example 4. Masquerades offer spiritual agency. Arts of Africa. Trade and colonization had profound impacts on African art. Trade and colonization had profound impacts on African art. such as we see in this salt cellar from chapter 12, which was commissioned by a Portuguese client who probably supplied much of the visual materials to the African artist who carved it. Arts of Africa. Photography was used in Africa as a tool of colonization, but African artists have adopted the medium to represent themselves. Trade and imperial expansion brought photography to Africa less than a year after its invention in 1839, where it became a tool of European exploitation and colonization. European explorers and colonial authorities used photography to record trips and describe people. They told a one-sided story of Europe conquering the continent and bringing civilization to its communities. Anthropologists documented colonized people, tending to treat their subjects like scientific specimens without regard to cultural values, individuality, feelings, and preferences. The photograph of the Oba's palace in Benin, taken following the punitive expedition of 1897, documented the looting of African cultural treasures. For outsiders who knew Africa as little more than a source of natural resources and people to enslave, the photograph supported a narrative of European superiority. Soon, however, African artists began taking photographs. Some photographers opened portrait studios in larger cities, while others traveled from town to town, setting up temporary studios in order to take photographs for the local residents. This photograph, by an unknown Senegalese artist, pictures a woman finely dressed with gold and silver jewelry. She follows the local custom that required women to cover all but their hands and feet, and she wears her hair in a popular local style that wove wool into the hair. Unlike the European photographers who turned their African subjects into exotic specimens for curious European viewers, this artist represents the Senegalese woman with dignity and respect for her culture. This concludes Chapter 18.